Hello, and welcome to the Think JSOU webinar series, brought to you by the Office for Strategic Engagements at the Joint Special Operations University. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the United States government, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Special Operations Command, and the Joint Special Operations University. If you have questions after the session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.edu.
Hello, I'm Dr. Tom Searle of the JSOU, the Joint Special Operations University. Today, I'm interviewing Daniel Wagner. Daniel Wagner has been managing cross-border risk in the private and public sector for more than 30 years, mostly in China and East Asia. He has worked for leading international insurance companies like AIG, private financial institutions like GE Energy Financial Services, as well as multilateral development banks like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. He also founded and ran his own company, Country Risk Solutions, for a decade. Mr. Wagner is the author of more than 700 articles on current affairs and risk management, and his work has appeared in the South China Morning Post, the Sunday Guardian, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. He is also the author of 10 books, including several on China. Today, we are going to discuss his latest book, The China Epiphany, Comprehending China's Relationship with America and the World. Welcome, Daniel.
Great to be with you, Tom.
So let's start off with the first question of why you wrote the book and what exactly is the epiphany that you mention in the title.
So as you mentioned, I worked for the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And while I was living and working in Beijing during zero COVID, I actually wrote the first draft of this book and put it down for a year. And then after I left Beijing, I sort of revised it and updated it. The idea behind the epiphany is that I've never been a China hawk. I don't believe that war is inevitable between the US and China. And the fundamental path forward, as I see it, is that since the CCP isn't going anywhere, and since America isn't going anywhere, that we ought to find a way to work together. And with all the rhetoric that's going on in Congress and on the Chinese side, it's easy to just get sucked further down into this abyss. And what I'm calling for is a little sanity in the relationship and basically an effort on the part of both sides to identify what works and what doesn't work and what can be done better. So that's the essence of the epiphany, because those people who believe that the CCP is about to collapse or that the Chinese economy is about to collapse, I just don't think that's about to happen. So we need to find a path forward.
Excellent. One of the themes of your book is China's effort to have it both ways. On the one hand, China wants to be treated like a developing poor country some of the time. Other times it wants to be treated as a rich and powerful country. It wants to be the leader and a role model in green energy while still being the leading producer of greenhouse energy and so forth. Could you please elaborate on some of those ways that China's trying to have it both ways and what you think we ought to do about it?
First of all, I think it's important to distinguish between the Chinese people and the country of China and the government. When we say China, we sort of lump them all together. And my frame of reference is that the people in China, they want the same thing out of life that we in the West do, and that China as a country is a great country. The issue that I've got and that many people have is with the CCP and the government and their actions. So the CCP is masterful at sort of taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back and keep doing it. And before you know it, there's a new boundary and a new normal. So since they're so masterful at doing this, we need to recognize when it's happening. We were asleep at the wheel with the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands and the expropriation that the CCP did. We've been asleep at the wheel at a number of other things. So part of what we need to do is get smarter about how we marshal our resources together with other countries that are like-minded and how we combine our strategies so that we have a common strategy for combating the CCP.
Your mention, your distinction between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic government, it calls out another one of the distinct dualities in your book, which is that you have great respect and admiration for the Chinese people and their hard work, as well as the ability of the Chinese government, and for that matter, the Chinese Communist Party, to get things done. And yet at the same time, you seem to be appalled by the way Chinese businesses and the Chinese government seem to cheat in order to get ahead. Could you elaborate some more on that duality for me and why you took that approach to your book?
Yes. So living and working in Beijing as I did really impressed upon me the awesome power of the CCP and their efficiency at getting things done. I'll give you an example. I went to work one day and the subway escalator was broken. And by the time I came back in the afternoon, it was fixed. And if you compare that with what typically happens, say, in America, where you might wait weeks or even months for that escalator to be fixed, I was very impressed by that. And if you take that concept and you, sort of apply it to some broader themes like the military and global economy, et cetera, and China's role, you have to recognize that they're really an awesome power. We're an awesome power as well, of course, but so many people don't really acknowledge that on the part of the Chinese. So that's where the duality comes from, is that, we can have these criticisms of them, but we also, I think, need to take a step back and say, yeah, actually, they're quite capable at doing quite a number of things. And then that really makes us stop and think about where we're going from here. I mean, are we going to be the leader in quantum computing forever? Is China going to become the leader in AI, as they hope to be by the end of this decade, et cetera, et cetera? And the application of the resources that the government does and its ability to combine the best of the public and private sectors to achieve its objectives are some things that maybe we don't have. We're caught up with political infighting, and we get excited about allocating $10 or $20 million to AI when they're allocating $150 billion by 2030. So my recommendation is that we keep things in perspective and plan accordingly.
Along those lines, though, you also talk about a pervasive distrust in China, where the government doesn't trust the people don't trust the government, employees and employers don't trust each other, and every party to a business transaction or a contract is expecting all of the other parties to try to cheat in any way they can get away with. How does that impact on China's foreign relations? And is that one of the reasons that China has had so much difficulty finding real allies of the sort that the United States seems to be good at developing?
Well, I think part of the reason why China has so few genuine allies is its own doing, a big part of the reason. We'll use the Belt and Road Initiative as an example. When the BRI was created in 2013, China had a choice. The Chinese government had a choice. They could give grants or they could give concessional loans. And instead, what they decided to do was to give loans that were actually quite expensive and needed to be paid back. And as a result, many of the countries that participated in the BRI ended up being highly indebted poor countries after they had graduated from that status. And so that created a lot of distrust. China then had, a sort of a second theory about how this should be done, but it was too late by that point. And I think if you look at some of the surveys that have been done by organizations such as Pew since 2018, they routinely show that the vast majority of the world does not want to be like China, and that the vast majority of the people don't trust China. So if China had decided to go about doing some of these things in a different way, I think the result would have been different. And of course, this spills over into the public domain, into foreign policy, et cetera. Generally, people and governments, they understand what China is and is not. And China, again, is masterful at doing anything it needs to do to get what it wants. And that's really not the best way to make friends in the international arena.
Well, one of the areas that you've had a lot of personal experience with is the multilateral development banks. And you had the rare privilege, I think, of being both on the World Bank staff, which is a classic example of the post-World War U.S. led international order, and also working for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is usually held up as a classic example of the Chinese Communist Party's effort to replace that U.S.-led order with a China-led order. Can you talk about your experience in those two and how China handled its roles in both of those?
So let's start with the World Bank. Even back when I was with the World Bank Group back in the 90s, there was very little that was done without the wink and the nod of China, even though it's first and foremost, an American-led institution. China was even decades ago very good at sort of elbowing its way to the front of the line and doing what it can to maximize its influence in such institutions. Fast forward to the AIB, which was created and started operation in 2016. It was actually created at about the same time as the BRI. They've gone to great pains on one hand to replicate the kind of governance and operational structure that the other MDBs, multilateral banks, have. And if you look at their ownership, for example, 30% is owned by China. Now, 30% of the Inter-American Development Bank is owned by the US. So they're not really doing anything in that regard that the US and other countries don't do in terms of maximizing their influence in some of these institutions. At the Asian Development Bank, for example, Japan is the dominant country. So there's no great crime in what they've done. The difference, I think, is that, first of all, the structure of the bank is quite different. It is not an MDB in a classical sense. They don't fight poverty, they don't give grants, they don't provide technical assistance. Their focus is solely on infrastructure development, primarily in Asia and some other developing countries. Now, what they've done in a very short period of time is truly impressive, if you ask me. They had only a few hundred staff, and they've managed to amass a lending portfolio of more than $50 billion and more than 200 projects, whereas a lot of other MDBs have, thousands, many thousands of staff and have been around for a half century or more. So kudos to the AIB in that regard. Now, there's been some concern about whether the influence of the CCP is oversized, and I think that concern is justified. But on the other hand, I don't know that, to the extent that that is true, that it's any different than, say, a US in the World Bank and a Japan in the ADB might be doing in terms of flexing their own muscles.
Very interesting. Now, that focus on infrastructure, does that reflect a different development model from the one that those other multilateral development banks are following, with that focus on infrastructure as opposed to a broader portfolio?
It is different. The AIB's motto is lean, clean, and green. And they've been kind of leaders in that regard from the beginning in trying to adhere to those objectives. It is a new business model. They're certainly concerned more about profit than some of the other MDBs are. And they're also concerned about not wanting to having to recapitalize. And some other MDBs don't have to worry about that or don't want to be worried about that. There are some differences, to be sure. I think it's easy to criticize AIB for wanting to create a different type of MDB. But if you look at the record of the bank, I think it speaks for itself in terms of what has been achieved in a very short period of time with very limited resources. If at the same time it's reflective of the CCP's values and objectives, I think, that's to be expected.
That leads me to my next question, which is about your point that People's Republic of China is going to be a very different sort of superpower from the ones we were accustomed to in the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States were very interested in what sort of ideology their partners had, and were quick to criticize over ideological issues. It seems that the PRC is not that way, and the United States and the Soviet Union were also very generous in giving things without expecting things directly in return, a quid pro quo necessarily, from their partners. And you seem to be saying that China is going to be much more focused on its own explicit financial self-interest. Is that correct? And how do you see China being People's Republic becoming a different sort of superpower?
That is correct in my experience, and I think all we really have to do is look at how the government of China has tried to maximize its influence in multilateral institutions and in other ways on the international stage. You know, if you look at the Inter-American Development Bank, for example, I think the Chinese ownership was something like 0.09%, but they had supersized influence in that institution. If you look at the UN, China, is leading 4 of the 15 UN agencies. No other country has done as much as that. So I guess the question becomes, is it bad that they're trying to maximize their influence and being successful in doing so, or is it worse that it's seemingly so easy for them to do it? In terms of what kind of superpower China will be, I mean, my hope is that they will become more mature as time goes on and grow out of simply looking at a quid pro quo kind of transactional relationship in terms of what is best for them. In fairness, my understanding is that in terms of contributing to UN peacekeepers and to other international operations that benefit other countries, China's come a long way since then. But we must keep in mind that China is and will remain the only proper peer that the US has had in the post-war era. And that puts it in a very special category. And we always need to be mindful of what that means. And as I suggested earlier, their ability to marshal their resources and combine the best of public and private sector gives them great power, even as they have a very challenging economic situation right now.
One of the major advantages the United States has enjoyed in competition with China and with others is the power of the US dollar in international trade, extraordinary power. And a lot of analysts have said that that position of the dollar looks very secure for the, at least for the midterm future. You seem to have a less optimistic view about the dollar, and particularly about the threat from Chinese national cryptocurrency. Could you expand on that view and also assess what you think the future of the dollar is as a reserve currency?
Well, I don't think the dollar is under any threat as a reserve currency in any time in the near future. But if China got to the stage where it wanted to, make its capital account open, and where more and more countries decided that they wanted to trade in yuan, I think there is a chance that the dollar could, get a run for its money. Right now, China is one of the leaders on a national level of cryptocurrencies. Part of the reason they're doing this is, of course, they want to maximize their control domestically over Chinese citizens. But another reason is that they want to utilize this to influence and perhaps partially control some other countries. I think China's objective is to see if success in the crypto arena might ultimately spill over in encouraging other economies to utilize the yuan. And there's certainly a chance that that may happen. So we'll have to just wait and see.
In your book, you stress that China's rise is inevitable, and it's something that we're going to have to deal with, and you advocate a pushing back against China's rise in a variety of ways, in a variety of places. At the same time, though, the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China emphasize that China's rise is inevitable, and that's a reason to not push back. It's a reason to acquiesce to China's wishes and to get a good deal early instead of fighting and getting a bad deal later with an even stronger competitor. How would you make the argument to Americans for why we should push back against an inevitably rising China?
Well, this is ultimately an ideological battle. And the question that is obvious to most Americans and many in the West is whether we would rather, yield to forms of authoritarianism and communism, or whether we would like to continue to have egalitarianism and liberal democracy reign in the world and in our countries. And as authoritarianism continues to creep into our own country and into many other democracies around the world, it's certainly a opportunity for China to flex its muscles. I don't blame China for wanting to flex those muscles and presuming that nothing is going to be given to it on a silver platter. If they get to the stage where they can come up with a formula where they are genuinely perceived as being communism light or socialism light, and where people perceive that the form of authoritarianism that pervades in China and in other countries that are allies of China is somehow not a bad thing, well, then I think we've got a real problem on our hands. But again, if those few surveys are anything to go by, I don't think we have anything to worry about for quite some time. The real concern from my perspective is that this creeping authoritarianism that's occurring in democracies will somehow gain a firmer hold, and that somehow the Chinese government might take advantage of that.
One of the features of sort of creeping authoritarianism or increasing reach from the Chinese Communist Party is technological in forms like TikTok. Do you share the U.S. government's view, as expressed by the Congress recently, that TikTok is a menace to America and its youth, and our ability to counter the Communist Party's influence?
Absolutely. I think there's an unfortunate tendency in America to get caught up in discussions of things like free speech when what is ultimately the subject of this debate on TikTok is national security. There's just no question in my mind that if the Chinese government can get access to data on Americans, it's going to use it. It certainly wants it, and it will scrape that data and add to the portfolio that it already has on most Americans because of their successful hacks of organizations like Equifax. They already know so much about us. And given their objectives and given how they can influence the American political process, as they are doing by encouraging all TikTok users in America to contact their Congress people and urge them not to ban or restrict the use of TikTok in America, that's not what an innocent social media platform does. This is a media platform which is definitely political in nature. And I think it's nefarious, it's dangerous. And I think the Congress is absolutely right, and the Biden administration is absolutely right to want to restrict this away from Chinese ownership. Because under, as you will be aware, the national security and other laws of China, any Chinese entity must hand over data that the government deems to be a national security interest. Well, clearly, the data that is delivered by platforms such as TikTok is exactly that. So I'm definitely opposed to having TikTok. In fact, I would go a step further. I don't think that any Chinese-owned or Chinese-run app should be permitted in America because they all have some link back to the Chinese government.
I liked your pointing out the example of TikTok proving the case against itself by using its data to encourage people to take the Chinese side in the political debate. I heard that described as an own goal. Along those lines, do you find that the Chinese Communist Party is a learning organization in the sense that learning institution in the sense that it will be able to learn from a mistake like that and not repeat it, or are the bureaucratic and institutional reasons for using that data just so strong that that it will continue to make those kinds of errors in the future?
I'm not sure they view it as an error. I think they view it as central to their modus operandi. And I think they view the data as so valuable that there would be no real reason to pivot from the way they do business now. And if you look into the future, I mean, I could certainly foresee the growth of this kind of behavior in other ways that we don't even necessarily recognize. For instance, they could try to hide their ownership or hide their involvement in other social media and other apps. Things are getting very sophisticated, and with the introduction of AI, we have these deep fakes and we have all sorts of risks to our electoral processes. And I just think, given how impactful it's already been, they probably don't have much of an incentive to change.
One of the other things that you mentioned in your book that seemed to run counter to things that I had seen in other publications was the focus on your treatment of ideology. In your book, you describe ideology as sort of an annoyance to most Chinese negotiators, that when they're in negotiations, they don't want any ideology involved because they want to have maximum flexibility in those negotiations. And yet, at the same time, the things I've heard about Xi Jinping thought and the changes in the way the Chinese Communist Party interprets the demise of the Soviet Union seem to emphasize making the Communist Party more communist and making the role in the of the Chinese Communist Party inside China and in its economy much stronger. How do you balance that? Is ideology going to become more central to the People's Republic in the future, or not?
I would argue that it's becoming more important with every passing day. You know, given the challenges that the Chinese economy has now, and in certain respects, China's relationship with many countries around the world, it's sort of like a tiger that's backed into a corner. And when a tiger's backed into a corner, it tends to lash out. If you look at what's going on in China, you'll see that there hasn't been this kind of a crackdown domestically on companies and on people since the Mao era. And my sense is that that is the direction that she has chosen to go. And I don't see any reason why there would be a change at this particular juncture. I could foresee a possible change in the future, maybe once things have gotten a little better economically and politically for Xi. But on the other hand, having gone down this road, I wouldn't be at all surprised if it lasts for quite some time, which is quite unfortunate for the Chinese people.
Well, it would seem also for the Chinese economy, because those they're lashing out against some of the most productive and the leading, growth leaders in the economy, and by clamping down on those, it would seem like it's only going to compound the economic challenges that China's facing.
I would agree, and it hasn't made it any easier vis-a-vis foreign investment, as there are very few companies that want to go into China now, and more companies continue to leave. There's still a majority that have decided that they're going to stick it out, but the operating environment is so difficult and challenging and constantly shifting that I think there will be more and more companies that decide to throw in the towel and simply say, we can't do this anymore.
So it does seem like the current trends then will continue into the future, and 5 or 10 years from now it will look much grimmer in all those regards than it does today.
It certainly looks that way, and I hope that isn't true for the businesses and the people that end up staying there, but that's certainly the way it looks right now.
Well, just as a final question, I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell our audience what you think the core message is that you would like people to get from your book, The China Epiphany.
So I think the core message is two or threefold. One is we need to do a better job of liaising with our allies and marshaling our resources together. We also need to create a joint strategy with our allies, so that a long-term strategy, so that we can have an expectation about how policy and strategy is going to unfold in the future. I also think we need to be realistic about what our own limitations are and what our own capabilities are. And where we see limitations, we need to do something to strengthen them. And that's going to require a lot more bipartisanship on the part of the US Congress and in some, rulemaking bodies in other countries, because China's got a lot of ability to just do whatever it wants to do whenever it wants to do it. One of the benefits of a dictatorship like this is that they don't have to ask permission to do anything, whereas we get caught up in all these laws and regulations and procedures. So that's a distinct disadvantage for us. We need to, I think, be clear about what our own objectives are and allocate resources to do it. And we also need to be clear to the Chinese that there will be some consequences for some things that they do that cross lines. We can no longer say that if you cross this line, there will be consequences, and then there aren't. If they cross lines, there have to be consequences. We have no choice.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. It's been a great pleasure talking to you today. Again, thank you for watching. And the book is China Epiphany, author Daniel Wagner. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.